Cool, okay, so thanks for coming. I know it's been a busy couple of days. You're probably all excited to be getting towards the end and heading off home and stuff. I'm going to talk to you about mobile dashboards and device designer. My name's Alex Crift. I'm a solutions consultant with Tableau. Been with Tableau a couple of years. Now, my first job, going back a little bit, was with a mobile applications development company called Scan Mobile, which you probably haven't ever heard of. But around that time, these are the phones that I had, sort of around the year 2000 or that sort of time. Does anyone recognize any of these? Anyone had any of these? I expect probably a lot of people did. Let's check this is actually on. My favorite was this one here. I had a red cover that I bought for that one, and I bought a ringtone as well, which was pretty cool. But this mobile applications company, we were pioneering things like shopping by text message and by WAP, if you remember that. And if I was honest, we also sold ringtones as well and probably made more money doing that than we did with the other stuff. But we actually had the services that were live with Orange and Vodafone at the time. So it's quite exciting for me to be here again now, sort of 20 years later almost, talking about mobile and actually, with Tableau as well. Seems like my career has kind of come round full circle. So what I'm planning to talk about today is these topics, really kind of covering the whole spectrum of things that I think are relevant in a few different ways. I'm going to leave it quite sort of flexible in terms of, if you've got questions or anything like that, I'll try and address them as we're going along. We haven't got a massive group, so feel free to stick up your hand. We'll make it a little bit interactive if we can do that. And at the end, I'm not sure how we'll do for time, but after the end, if you want to come up and ask me some questions, I'll hang around for a bit so we can do that as well. All this content will be available afterwards, so you'll be able to come back and have another second look too. Okay, so this must be a scene that's probably familiar to many of you. I've been commuting into London for about 10 years or so on the train, and in that time, this scene has become more and more common. I'd say probably 10 years ago, the majority of people would have been looking at a book or maybe a newspaper, still a lot of people looking at the metro, but nowadays, this is really, really common. People are using mobile devices. If you'd see me in that picture, I've probably got my laptop open. I still think of that really as a mobile device, but people are sitting there using tablets and phones and whatever, and they're busy whatever it is they're doing. Now sometimes I look around me on the carriage and I kind of guess what people are doing, and I kind of then see if you can actually confirm whether you're right, and it's often surprising, the kind of, the older, more serious looking guy in a sharp business suit, he's the one who's actually playing Candy Crush, furiously kind of pressing away. You get a whole range of people doing different things on there. But that's become very, very normal now. People get off the train and they keep looking at these devices. They're walking down the road. You see this, I come out at London Bridge and I'm walking down the road, and this is really, really common. And you kind of got to wonder, where is this heading? What are people doing with these things? And are we going to start seeing things like this in the future? Now I think this was actually a research project somewhere in Asia, but it was a real piece of work that happened, and there are, presumably arguments for doing this for real. Now there's a downside to this too. So this was some research from 2015, and you can see that while road traffic accidents in general going down sharply, pedestrians are in peril. And this research linked that directly to the fact that we've got mobile devices that are very distracting. A friend of mine, actually a colleague, was telling me the other day he's got some noise-cancelling headphones, and he's stopped himself from using those whilst he's walking along the street because they're so dangerous, he says. So whether he's looking at a device or not, that's another piece of technology that is potentially endangering himself there. So what are we all doing with these devices? Confession time. So I'll go first. For me, it depends a bit on where I am, but I would say I've got this train journey every day, and that's probably the time in my day when I look at my phone the most often. And what I tend to do there is I'm probably looking at the news, maybe a bit of sport. I also will look at my email at that time. And what I tend to do with email is I'll read them, and very occasionally I might reply to one, kind of tapping away on my phone. But mostly I just read them because I know that later on I'm going to get a chance to answer those emails properly. And then I would also say I probably watch a Netflix series every now and then, something like that. That also happens. So anyone else? Can I pick on you?
Well, let's do 7 minutes before work.
Okay.
I use that to phone my brother.
So you're using your telephone as a telephone. That is a novel idea.
And on the way home, I just walk home.
Okay, fair enough. Anyone else? Come on.
I'm the same as you, actually. I've got an hour and 10 on the train in the morning, so it's a quick scan, news, emails, bit of Facebook thing.
Okay, no Candy Crush.
No.
Okay.
No, I don't play games. My kids use my phone for playing games.
Yes. Yes, that happens. Okay, so I've been thinking about this, and I think, you can kind of break it down into categories. There are things that can't wait. Got my phone out, I'm sending a message home, I'm going to be a bit late, do we need another bottle of wine? That kind of question, Things initiated by someone else, so maybe the phone rings. I've got a friend who lives in Bath who literally only got a mobile phone for the first time last year, and his way of thinking of it was, why would I want to carry something around with me that allowed people to telephone me wherever I was? Why can't they just leave a message and I'll pick it up when I get home on the answer phone? He just thought of it completely differently. But, some people think like that. Things you're doing with someone else, I don't know, looking at photos you've taken, whatever it might be. Things that happen in particular places. Is anyone still looking for Pokemon? Oh, okay, there's one. There's a guy on my team as well who's out there doing that. I think for a lot of people, it's making good use of the time. You're kind of sat on that train journey. You've got that period of time every day. I certainly treat that as work time mostly. And then I put that one in at the end actually just recently because I think I've realized that with the mobile devices, they're sort of programmed, they're full of things that are vying for your attention. So they're interrupting you constantly. And it's quite difficult to just focus on doing one thing. Several things at once going on there. But I think this is equally true. Each of these are true when you start thinking about BI content, reporting, analytics, the kind of things that people are going to have with Tableau coming through on mobile devices as well. So, things that can't wait, that can be maybe your executive who's going from meeting to meeting. They don't actually have a chance to get back to their desk during the day, but they want to keep on top of their sales figures as they're going along. So for them, having that kind of, those high-level KPI metrics style dashboard, that's really useful for them. Things initiated by someone else, so as Tableau introduces more and more of these features that allow commenting and collaboration and things like that, you're going to get a ping that appears on your phone saying, someone has commented on your sales figures or whatever it might be. It's going to interrupt you and draw you to go and look at a chart or something wherever you happen to be. Things that happen with someone else in particular places. I'm thinking there about, I work with a lot of healthcare organizations, so it could be a carer who's out in the community working with a patient, being able to see that patient's record or medical history, some of those kind of things there and then is really, really useful. I had a call last week with English Institute of Sport, and we were talking to one of the guys who prepares visualizations for the taekwondo team and actually someone else who does for the canoeing team. And the coaches there use that, but they're literally, they buy the canoeing course with the crews discussing their coaching session, and they want to be able to look at how their times are trending, over the weeks as they go by. So, that wouldn't work if they had to wait until they got back to their desk. They may not even have a desk, those people. Making good use of the time, I think that applies as well, because these days you've got that sort of time period when you're doing something like traveling. A lot of people will use that just to extend their working day, and they want to have access to all the things they'd normally expect to have access to there too. But I think with all of these, the context is really key. So it's who you are, where you are, what you're doing, who's with you, what else you're doing at the same time. That's, I think, even more relevant when you're thinking about the mobile devices than it is when you're thinking about just someone sitting at their desk through their working day. Okay. I've got a couple of examples just to show Tableau examples just to show some of the things that are relevant really with the sort of mobile use case. So this is an example of the kind of thing they use at Southern Health. So this is on Tableau Public, produced by Simon Beaumont. Now I spoke to him and he said actually this isn't currently displayed and used on a tablet, but it would fit quite nicely on a tablet. It's a laptop that they have at the moment, but that's just because they haven't yet implemented the technology to enable it on the mobile devices yet. But it is used by the staff on the wards, and it allows them to see at a glance what patients have come in, what the sort of history is in terms of contacts with those patients for each of them. So the ones at the top are the ones that have come in the last 24 hours, and then the bottom section is all the ones that have been there for a longer period than that. But he said this is one of the ones that gets used the most there. At a glance, really, really useful information. And it's all there. I mean, they might use a couple of filters at the top, but it's not heavily interactive. That's one of the key things for it. It's at a glance, and they can just take away what they need to straight away. Now, I saw this one, and I love this idea. So kind of bear in mind that the original dashboard was the bit of wood between the back of the horse and where you were sat in your car. And that's evolved now. We're used to the idea of a dashboard in a car having these controls and things on it that help us. But now you can have a dashboard on your bike as well. Obviously, that's not a Tableau visualization. That's an app on a smartphone, I think. But I think the message there is very, very similar. It's tailored to the context of how it's being used. And if you're cycling, doing some off-road cycling, you don't want something that's heavily interactive. You just want a few sort of key metrics at a glance, and that's all you need at that particular moment in time. Okay, it's another example from the big book of dashboards, actually. This one produced by Andy Kirk. So it's a fictional name and a fictional team, but this is actually used by a Premiership football team. And what I like about this one is again, the context of how it's delivered and how it's used. So the idea with this is that on a Monday morning when the team get together again for training, they all sit down for breakfast when they first meet up again. And this shows the comparative performance from when they met or from when they played at the weekend. So they're sat down with the rest of their team amongst their peers looking at this peer comparison dashboard. I think there's no interaction there, but each of them gets this at the moment when they're about to sit down and have that conversation. So this becomes the focus of that conversation as they're getting ready for their training day. So the timing of when this is delivered out is really significant with this one. And again, it sits nicely on a mobile screen. It's kind of been given that layout. It's actually quite clever in that there's a lot of information there, but it's easy just to absorb that at a glance. You can see where you're at the top and where you're at the bottom and all that kind of thing there. Okay, so through the rest of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today, just want you to be thinking a bit about those examples and this idea about the context being really, really important. Who is looking at the content? When are they looking at it? What else are they doing alongside that? Is it just a stopgap, like me with my emails that I just read and then I'm going to come back and do a sort of more serious job of looking at it later on? Because I think that's a common mobile use case as well. Okay, I'm going to jump into the next section now, which is what is a device designer? So So Tableau introduced this back in version 10.0, so getting on for 2 years ago now. And it's developed a little bit in that time, but more or less it's stayed the same since when it first came in. Now, can I just ask anyone who's used Device Designer to just put their hands up? Okay, good. So sort of some in the room. So for some of you, this will be new ideas. Some of you have used it a bit before. But hopefully, for everyone, we'll show you some bits and pieces that you will find useful. One thing to point out on this, so actually, a few weeks back, I realized that there was an update coming along in the next release of Tableau, 2018.2. And I very nearly kind of rewrote some of this content, but actually, as that hasn't been released yet, I will give it a little mention and I'll show this, but it's not part of the standard functionality. But there is a quite significant change coming in the next release, which will be in a week or two's time. Okay, so I'm going to show this in a minute. I won't talk about these sort of screenshots too much. I'll show you a real example. But why have we done this? So, as we've just talked about, mobile devices are being used everywhere now. People expect sort of the continuation of their working activity to carry on to an extent once they leave their desk, or even when they're on their way home, when they're at home. And the devices that they've got with them, the technology you have with them, technically can enable that. I think the point near the bottom there, it supports Tableau's mission. We're helping people to see and understand data wherever they are, whatever they're doing. The fact that you're not at your desk shouldn't be a limiting factor there. And then the last point as well, there are some actually quite good examples of people who were finding ways to do this anyway without the device designer. So, the community was working on this challenge, but what we've done is just to make it a lot more straightforward. Okay, so I'm going to jump into a little bit of a demo now, and I'm going to show the current version of Device Designer, and I will show a little bit of what's coming in a week or two. And then I'll come back and talk about some of the details in a minute. Okay, so I'm going to open up current release of Tableau Desktop. Now, a few weeks back, I put onto Tableau Public a workbook which is charting the results of the World Cup. So sorry if you're all fed up with that already, but there's going to be a bit more World Cup now. So I'm just going to make a copy of that one. I'll come back to that in a minute. But I'm going to use this as my example. Okay, so this is the dashboard that I'm going to show, but just so you get a quick idea, there are 3 dashboards in this workbook. There's one which I kind of called the catch-up. It's got sort of quite a few charts on it and sheets, and this is intended to give you sort of an overview of like the next 3 games, the most recent games, the table positions and the knockout stages up to point, also the top scorers, that kind of stuff there. I've got an overview of the different matches, and there's a bit of functionality on here. So if I click on one of these, you see some more details about the teams in there. There's a little bit of Visin tooltip, a few examples, and a lot of the reasons I put some of these things in is so that I can come back and talk about them a bit later on when we look at some of the best practices and the pitfalls with Device Designer and designing for mobile. But the one I'm going to focus on just for now, just a simple example, is this one, which is just the tables, the group standings, and then where we are at the moment in the knockout stages as well. Okay, so first point is that you start with a dashboard, and it's the dashboard that you're going to adapt for the mobile layouts. So don't think about converting a workbook, and don't think about individual sheets. The dashboard is the level where we're going to start. And this is the button that we introduced and kind of opens up the rest of the functionality there. So if I now say I want a device preview on this tables dashboard, you can see I now have the option of saying, well, which one am I going to create here? So if I say desktop, it gives me then a range of resolutions for desktop. If I just say generic, and I can say add the desktop layout. So over here now, you can see I've got the default, which was the original one, and the desktop one beneath it. Now, often the desktop one isn't much different in terms of layout and size from the default. There are reasons why you might have them different, and I'll come back to that. But to really understand or sort of emphasize where these things get to be different, I'll introduce a tablet one, and I'm going to introduce a phone one as well. I'm just using the sort of generic resolution, but there's a whole list there you can choose from. Okay, so you can see now here I've got default, desktop, tablet, and phone layouts. We're all still same workbook, same dashboard, but I can now start to adapt each of these. So if I say desktop, I want this one to just fit all, so fit the space that's available. You can see it's kind of stretched out to fit the default resolution for that one. With a tablet, you actually can't see very well because there's a blue background, but you can see there's this grey box now which sort of marks out the edge of the height and width that it's giving us for the tablet layout. Again, if I just do fit all for tablet, that often works okay. So quite often the tablet view, the desktop view, about the same sort of sizing. But with a phone, you can see the width only comes out to here. So if I say fit all, you can see it squashes everything right in there. And you can see that would fit on the phone screen nicely, but it's almost unusable. So the next challenge is, okay, well, how do I adapt this a little bit to make it work effectively on a phone? So rather than fit all, I'll say fit width. People tend to want to scroll vertically on a smartphone. That seems to be the kind of convention that people are adopting. So if you fix the width on these things and adjust the height, that will usually work quite well. If I change this a little bit, you can see it's giving me a little bit more height, and actually immediately everything is stretched out to take that height. And it will continue to do that as I add more height on there up to a certain kind of point, and I'm not sure, to be honest, how far it goes before eventually it will just start giving you kind of empty space at the bottom there. Sure. I will talk about portrait and landscape, and the question about the mobile app as well I'll talk about as well. So at the moment I'm not really worrying about whether someone's going to view this using the app or just a browser. I will come to that, but it's a valid point. At this stage, there's nothing you need to do to specify which of those is going to be used. Okay, so I'm going to come back and talk about some of the detail of why I'm doing these bits and pieces and how I'm doing it. But for now, I'm just going to adapt this one quickly so that it will work. It will display quite nicely on a mobile. You can see I've changed the height. I've set to fit width. If I now say I'm going to make this a custom layout, that means that this layout is going to be a bit different in certain ways from the default layout that I started with. And I'm just going to kind of work down and add a couple of bits and change a couple of bits on here. So I'm going to add a container there to pop these buttons into. I'm going to take off one of these images because I don't really need that twice. I'll squash up the sizing on that. And then this one here, I'm going to drop that into the top of that container that's there. And I'll stretch these down a little bit just so they give them a little more room. But now you can see relatively quickly, I've got something you can see. Each of the sheets is displaying reasonably well, and you've got that vertical scrolling that's going to work quite nicely. I've taken a little bit of content away, because I don't feel like I need it. And I'm happy now that this device layout for phone is going to show pretty clearly on a device. But I haven't changed the tablet layouts or the desktop and the default. They still contain all of the content they had and the layouts that they had as well there. So it's only the phone layout that's really had significant change there. Now I actually did a bit of Blue Peter. Here's one I made earlier. So rather than making you suffer watching me go through the publication process, and because I've got Google Sheets sources and stuff, that actually takes a minute or two. So I'm just going to show, if I can get the technology to work, how this looks when I'm viewing this on my phone through, and I'm going to use the mobile app. So that's the snapshot. I'll talk a little bit more about the mobile app in a minute. I'll just click on that one, and then I get the interactive actual device layout for the dashboard that I've just published there. So this is it now on my phone, and that's viewing that just as I wanted it to. And it's working pretty neatly. If I want to look at the same thing where it's published in Tableau Online, sure.
Make that a vertical scroll.
Yep.
And you laid that out horizontal scroll with the same as well.
Yeah, sure. So if I had set it out so it only had the fixed height, but the width was going across, then it would be a sideways. Yeah. So there you are. So this is the actual same thing that's being displayed now through a browser. You can see it's got that layout when we look at it in the browser the other way on the phone. Now I've just done the very simple implementation of it just so you can see it just working that way once of all. I'm going to go through and talk about some of the details of how it's working and some of the questions and the pitfalls and things, and then I'll come back at the end and I'll show a couple more examples actually in Tableau as well. Okay. So, as we saw, it starts with the dashboard. I think some people come into this expecting that they might have, I don't know, a different workbook or a different sort of sheets or something, but it's the dashboard is the focus point for setting this stuff up. And there's some terminology around, I've already used some of it, but you can think of that dashboard as being the parent and then 3 children beneath it. Desktop, tablet, and phone. And what we call them is default dashboard up at the top, and then the others are device layouts. And the device layouts, there's only a choice of 3, desktop, tablet, and phone. Now, in terms of where you can make changes, I made a couple of changes in that example there. I took away a little bit of content, and I rearranged a few things on there. Now there's rules, I suppose, around where you can make specific kinds of change, and there's best practice around that. So I'm just going to kind of summarize how you should be approaching these things now. So it's best to think of the fact that you're going to do your creation at the default level. So things like whether a sheet is included or not across, globally, you define that up at the default dashboard. Formatting. If you put formatting into a sheet up in the default, then it will be inherited down here. The initial sizing, so whether something is automatic or whether you're fixing that, again, that's set up at the default. Dashboard actions. That's a dashboard property. It's not a separate thing that you define on each device there. So there's quite a number of things that you're defining up at that default dashboard level. And I suppose one more thing to mention, I don't really call it out here, but if you start to make changes on a sheet, that sheet is being reused across the default and the device layout. So if you start to change a detail on the sheet, that will carry all the way through. You know, whichever one you happen to be looking at the time, that will be a global change there. So you've definitely got to have this approach of thinking, well, I get my default ready first, and then I start thinking about the device layouts. How many device layouts do I need? Well, if you didn't have one, so if you just said, oh, I don't think anyone's going to look at this on a tablet, then what would happen? The default dashboard actually just gets passed down and gets used in that situation. So that may be something you're happy with, but just be aware of the fact that you don't necessarily have control over the devices that connect to something, so that will happen, and your default dashboard better be ready for that situation. So I would say the answer really is make the 3 device layouts, even if 1 or 2 of them are very much the same as your default, put them in place anyway, and then you just know that you've got it all covered. Okay, so when we talk about the changes that you make at the device layout level, we're talking about customization then. So what you're doing here is you're making each of those device layouts different from each other, different from the default, and there's a number of ways you can do that. So as you notice in my example just then, so the button over there switches from being default to custom at the point when you start to make particular changes. And you can think of it almost as you're kind of cutting the cord, if you like, between the device layout and the default for particular aspects of how it's laid out and prepared. So one key point, this one. So I can remove a sheet from a device layout, and I did that with the little image of the World Cup on that. It would be the same if it was an actual sheet. So I can remove it from there. That's fine. What you can't do is the opposite, which is to say, I've got some sheets I haven't used yet. They're not in my default. They're not in any of the device layouts, but I think they're formatted just right for one of my device layouts. I'm just going to drag that one in now. So you actually can't do that. So any of the content that you're going to have across these 3 has to be in the default layout. So that's one thing to be aware of, and I'll come back to that when we talk about the best practice behind these things, because people will use specific strategies to work with that, I suppose, restriction. So you can remove a sheet. You can actually come back and put that sheet back in again later on. Tableau doesn't stop you from doing that. You can resize. I did a bit of that. You saw that, just moving things around and stretching them out and so on. You can swap their positions. That's fine. You can add in things like text boxes, images, containers. I did that. The vertical container I put in. You can do all of those kind of things. Similarly with parameters and filters. You can update the sizing behavior as well. You see I changed it from fit all to just fitting against the width and adapting the height. It's fine. So you can see you've got this situation where there's a number of changes which you need to do or are best to do at the default dashboard level. And then there's a whole other set of things which really happen on individual device layouts. And that point at the bottom, just kind of reiterate that. So, quite often, and I actually had this in one of my examples as well, when you look at a sheet and how it's displaying on your mobile device, I've got the sort of the formatting on one of my pieces of text. Actually, some parts of it are not showing at all, just because I've kind of put them in the wrong place. Now, if I go back and start editing that change is going to show everywhere that sheet is used. So there is a kind of restriction. If you're going to be designing a workbook for use across different mobile devices, some aspects you've kind of got to think about, well, is this going to work? Is this sheet going to work across the different devices there? And there are ways to cope with that. I'll show you an example of that in a minute or two. Okay. So thinking about the customization you can do, you can choose just to do nothing. The default view will just show. And actually, you know, I'll show an example of what happens when you connect on a mobile device. You know, it probably isn't going to look great if you just do nothing. For those really, I mean, I'd say rules or guidelines, make one default dashboard. You can only have one. Give it all 3 children. Think about which aspects you're controlling on the default, and then further customization on the device layouts. So this is an example of what happens if you do nothing. So you can still connect, you know, in terms of the technology will allow you to connect through, so long as you have the infrastructure in place and the security permissions and so on. But that's what I actually get on my phone if I connect to that one when I haven't prepared a device layout. So that's just the default layout out there. And on the tablet, you can see it's actually not too bad. It sort of displays okay, but it depends on the dimensions you've given that, the default in the first place. Okay, so this is a question. How does Tableau decide which layout to apply? And increasingly, we're seeing more and more device fragmentation, I think is the phrase. So this question is becoming more and more important because, you know, smartphones are getting bigger, some tablets have got smaller, and they're kind of blurring the lines of what these things are. So, step back a little bit. The first answer to that is if you're using the Tableau mobile app, then it will tell Tableau what kind of device is connecting and which layout to send through. So there's another good reason for using the mobile app. Other reasons for using the mobile app, it's really, really good. It's tailored for that touch screen interaction. So things like filters and things like that, you know, they pop up in a way that works really well on that kind of device. There's all sorts of other technical reasons as well, like, you know, the ability to set up single sign-on and things like that more easily. The offline snapshots, really, really useful as well. So there's a whole host of reasons why it makes sense to use the mobile app if you can. I won't go on about the mobile app anymore in this session. The other way that Tableau tells is by looking at the dimensions of the embeddable space from the device. And what we mean by that is, so each device has got a height and a width, as you can see here, and it will actually take the smaller of those 2 dimensions. So if you're in portrait mode, it will then take the width. Landscape mode, it will take the height. And it then uses that, and it's got its own way of judging whether that then means, you know, this looks like it's a mobile device. I'm going to send the mobile device layout, sorry, the phone device layout through to this user. One thing to consider that might catch you out is if you are designing something you know is going to be embedded in an iframe on a web page, then you're reducing the embeddable space that's available there. So it might switch suddenly into, I don't know, showing the tablet view rather than the desktop view you're expecting. Now, you know, if you're aware of that, you can work with that and then deliberately set it up so it's going to behave in the way that you want. So as I said, so Tableau is going to make a decision. You know, Tableau server has got all the different device layouts available, and it's going to send out the one that it thinks is appropriate. So it's looking at the dimensions of the embeddable space for the device, and it will send out the device layout that it thinks it should send. Now, through that mechanism, effectively what we're doing is we're kind of shrinking down you know, that whole range of different devices that are available, and we're going to basically say, well, it's either going to be one of these 3 brackets that we're then working with. Okay, good. So I'm going to show now, well, actually just a couple more slides, just sort of talking about some of these points to watch out for and pitfalls, I suppose. And then I'm going to show some of the examples and things that you can do to overcome some of those challenges as well. So one of the things that catches people out is when you're publishing and you've got, as I have in my example there, some of those kind of buttons, so there's a filter action, it's just a box with a word on it, but it allows me to jump from one dashboard to another within my workbook. Now, taking mobile out of the picture for the moment, if you just publish that as a standard dashboard intended to be used on desktop, you have to publish using show sheets as tabs. Otherwise, those filter actions don't work. Now, the awkward thing is, if you are using show sheets as tabs, then the device layouts don't show. So it's a bit frustrating at the moment, but that's current functionality limitation, I suppose, is you're kind of caught one way and you're caught the other way. But there is an alternative. So the way around it is to actually say, rather than using a filter action in that way, is I'm going to use a URL action. And I did this myself just yesterday to test it through. And what it means is I actually published them first up, and then I took the URL from each dashboard, and then I just wrote that into my URL actions on each button, published it again. It took me about 10 minutes. Just have to do it the one time. I could probably have worked out what the URL would have been in advance, but it's a bit lazy, so just did it that way. The other option, there are numerous ideas in the Tableau forums relating to this sort of topic, but there's an example there, specifically requesting for this bit of functionality. And I think when we address this, we'll do it in a kind of, we'll take a step back and we'll address this kind of issue in a really comprehensive way, and we'll introduce navigation buttons, I think, which will cover this kind of thing. And I know that's something that's been asked for quite a bit over the years. But I mention that because at the moment it is a bit of a pitfall, and you might find you publishing something up and you're saying, why is my device layout just not displaying correctly? Could well be because you've got sheets as tabs turned on, and then you've done that because you needed the buttons to work, that kind of thing. So it could catch you out. Okay, so the question earlier on about portrait and landscape was a good question. The device layout doesn't have, the device designer doesn't have a separate layout for portrait and landscape. But what it does allow you to do, I'll try and remember to show this in a second, is to just toggle between the two, so you can see how Tableau is going to display that. And that actually works quite nicely, so it means that you as the creator, before you publish something up, you can at least check straight away how it's going to display on the device there. Now, I suppose this is, I kind of stuck it in here, but it's probably a point that's worth talking about in general, is throughout this, you're sort of at the mercy of some of the design decisions that you make when you're designing your dashboards. And I would particularly say, when you're thinking about having different device layouts, using floating objects is going to introduce some complexity and challenges, because you're going to have less control over where those floating items are going to appear on your dashboard there. So use the containers, put everything in its place. You're much more confident then that everything is going to display correctly. And along with that, what I found is that I use the ability to fix the height or the width on objects quite tactically. So if you've got a container which has got, say, 3 objects in it, and 2 of them you always want to show just, quite small in the corners, set those ones so they've got fixed width on them. But then have that middle one there so that it's not got a fixed width. So it's, regardless of the device, it's always just going to fill the space that's available between the 2. So I find myself using that sort of tactic just to ensure that, suddenly you don't have a little image that was supposed to be smaller suddenly jumped up and become really big on a particular device layout. So, depending on the particular design that you've got and the content you've got, different, I suppose different priorities might be in play, But think about the fact that you've got those tactics and strategies you can call on there. Another one to think about. So if your dashboard has been kind of designed with people's, interacting using a mouse cursor, and then suddenly you're saying, well, actually now it's going to be someone using their finger on the screen to interact, then there are one or two things that are potentially going to cause a problem. So for example, on a map, rather than just dragging on the map being a scroll as it would be with your mouse cursor typically, if you switch off the pan and zoom, then someone who on their mobile device swipes across on that, they're not going to find that the dashboard stays the same. It's just the map that's kind of scrolled off out of the way. No, so what I mean by that is just in the options for the map, so you can control whether the pan and zoom. Yes, I would say so. It's a good question though. I would say that is a sheet level setting. It wouldn't be set per device layout. Yeah. Another one that I've seen people do is to add a very thin kind of container, just a strip up the side, maybe make it sort of call it out in a slightly different color or something, but give people something that they can use as a scroll bar. It doesn't have to take up much space. And maybe one of those things that, once, if you're in your organization, you're trying to establish some conventions about how this kind of stuff is done consistently. Once people know to look for the scroll bar and they're expecting it to be there, then they'll find that. It doesn't have to be called out in big red letters. But that can give you an option. Okay, and then tooltips is another one. So the way that the mobile app works with the tooltips is it's actually quite similar, but when you're kind of, I think what's different is that you kind of press on a point and then the tooltip will display. So you don't quite get the same sort of thing as you have when you're just, you pass your cursor over a scatter plot and all the tooltips display. It's a little different from that. But sure, viz and tooltips will work, and if you're thinking about whether it's appropriate or not, you don't necessarily want the great big tooltips coming up because they're going to block out a large part of your screen. I find that with designing for a mobile device, I will turn off tooltips on quite a few sheets. I'll leave them on some where I think they're adding something, but you've got to think a little bit about how they're going to work there. But then that's a sheet level setting that you're thinking about there. Okay, I'm going to jump in and show you a couple of examples. So the first example is going to be when we first introduced Device Designer, there was on Tableau Public, there was an Iron Viz mobile edition. And this one was the winner. So, I think it was a guy called Curtis Harris, I think. Now straight away you can see he's doing something a bit mad here. He's got a really weird layout on the default there. And what he's doing is he's putting some sheets over here that are going to only stay for the phone device layout, some that are over there for the tablet and the desktop. So this is how he's getting around that challenge of the fact that you can't add sheets in for a particular device layout. He's putting them all in the default. I don't know what's going on there. So you can see then for desktop, this just fills the space effectively. Scrolls down nicely. For tablet, same thing. Those sheets fit quite nicely on the tablet view. But on the phone, that's what you get there. Now, this is a really effective strategy, I think, for that sort of situation, where you know you've got a lot of detail in there, especially something like this, you know, which he's a lot of time and work on and spent a lot of time thinking about the formatting and so on. So he knows that he wants to give people a very different experience for the mobile device there. You got a question? Well, exactly, yes. So good point. So if you have all three device layouts, then the default view is never going to show, because the full range of, you know, the different embeddable space thresholds is covered. You know, it's either less than a threshold, in which case it will show the phone view, or it's in the middle and there'll be tablet, or it's more and then it will be desktop. So you're safe, and actually some people talk about the default layout as being a staging area. You know, just put everything in there, because you know you're going to take the bits out and leave the bits behind as you need them. Okay. IMAP. Oh, in an iframe. Yep.
Is it better to have a separate workbook for your book? It might be the wrong one.
Well, it's a good question. So the question is, if you know that you're going to be embedding some content that's going to be displayed within another web page, within an iframe, that kind of thing, is it a better idea to have a separate workbook for that kind of situation? And I think, and it's probably a good argument for saying that that's a good idea. It depends a little bit if you know, will it also be used in different device layouts? And is it quite... Yeah, sure. And I think with these things, you know, people don't want to do rework. So if you know that there's a particular dashboard that's kind of going to evolve over time, you might just say, well, you know, we don't want to be publishing different versions of that workbook for different devices and different situations, because then you've got a kind of content management challenge. So we just want one version of the workbook, and we want it to work however it's viewed. But another person might say, we're just doing this once, we want it to work this way for this one, and we'll copy it and we'll change it for this one. Yeah, you could do that, sure. Yep. So I'm just going to show you very quickly, you know, this one's showing in the browser there. I would say this, you know, we in the team have talked about this challenge of the fact that you can't develop sheets and just bring them in for the device layouts you want. But this is the strategy that we've seen in the Tableau community for how people address that. So you start with everything in the default, take them out for the different device layouts then. So as you can see, that's displaying really nicely there. And so this is how it then appears on the phone there. Okay. So I suppose the other thing that you get then is the ability to tailor things like actions, because you've got different sheets that are triggering those actions. So you're not trying to kind of make use of the same action appearing across different device layouts. So that would really help there too. The question about the portrait and landscape. So I'll just go back to my example that I had from before. So you can see here that it does give you the option of toggling portrait and landscape, and it allows you then to see how it's going to appear in each case. So it keeps the same height there. It would almost be nice to see, you know, you've got a portrait height and width, and then I'd like to see a landscape height and width differently. But current version, we don't have that. I have no idea if that's coming in the future. But at least now you get a sense of how that interaction is going to work. I also realized that this looks like it's fixed width on there. Kind of the point I was talking about earlier on. I'd like it if my the buttons over here were the ones that were fixed, and this one was variable. So thinking about that point from before. Okay. Because it still knows that it's a phone device because it's looking at the minimum dimension from the embeddable space. So it still knows there. So it doesn't cross over from one to the other in the device layouts. But I see your point. It's a good question. So the other one I was going to show was about what happens with the tooltips. So this one here I have, and this is actually the version that I set up with the URL actions rather than just the filter actions. So even though I don't have the sheets showing as tabs, these buttons do work here, switching between one dashboard and another. That might have just been the snapshot actually. So let's just see while this one comes through. But it's worth thinking about the tooltips, how they're going to work, particularly if you're using the fact that you can click on the dimensional values within tooltips, and they then act as, they have an interaction that's triggered from there. Do you want people to be doing that against your mobile device view or not? So there's some questions there about how you want that to work. And I suppose, I think the underlying theme for all of this is, Tableau gives you the mechanism to create these things quite easily, but you've got to work it through and test it through. Get feedback from your users as well. It doesn't necessarily do all the hard work for you. It gives you the tools so that you can work through that process with people. Well, you could if you had two sheets. And you said, I'm going to use this sheet for mobile, tooltips turned off, this sheet. Yeah. But then it's a question of saying, exactly, you keep your default there with a different set of sheets for each layout, if you want to go down that route, that is. Good question. Let's try that. Let's go back here. So, yeah, so just that quick test there suggests that on a device layout you can make a sheet floating that's not then floating on the others. So it does give you that option. Now what I wanted to show just as a sort of finishing point was I've got my tooltip on here. Now it does pop up and show, but straight away you can see the kind of challenge that you've got because it's taking up loads of space on my screen. So you've got to think about, is that tooltip actually providing enough value to make people want to use that in the way that it's provided there? I think in a lot of cases, it kind of comes back to almost thinking about taking interactivity out for the user in the context that they're in. Is a tooltip going to add something to them? Maybe, maybe not. So I've got to kind of wrap up now, but I will be here for a little while afterwards if people want to come and ask me some more questions. So a few links there to things that I've mentioned as I've gone along and people I ought to thank. But I hope that's kind of been useful for everyone as an introduction. I hope it makes you feel inspired to go and give it a try if you haven't done it before. And I'm maybe, is anyone here thinking, actually the piece of work I did recently, I'm going to go back and add device layouts onto that? Yeah, that's good to hear. Cool. Okay, so my email address is on there as well if you want to get in touch and ask me any more questions or send me some screenshots of examples or something like that. I'd be really interested to see it. Please do fill out the survey. You'll find that in the app underneath the section about this session. And, well, I hope you've enjoyed the conference. Have safe trips home. Thanks very much.